Newfoundland, an island of rock possessed by ocean. Having withstood the Atlantic's fury, the rugged shores were battered by new storms, the storms of man. By the late 1600s, tens of thousands of fishermen, mostly from France and England, were making seasonal journeys to Newfoundland for the cod. Along these wild shores, there were fierce disputes over fishing territory. Even more frightening, pirates preyed on the hundreds of ships bound for the fishery. On Newfoundland itself, these marauders terrorized undefended fishing stations and tiny settlements. Although isolated on North America's Atlantic fringe, Newfoundland had a history that was marred by European war. These symbols of violence now lie forgotten, but are reminders that this was once bloody ground. The prized cod fishery made Newfoundland a target in times of European war. Over generations, English and Irish men and women established roots here. Fishermen poured into the best harbors. The Beothuk, Newfoundland's only indigenous people, were pushed to extinction by starvation, disease, and murder. Increased English settlement and trade led to the island finally becoming an official British colony in 1825. Its decades as a colony were to be dominated by issues of power, class, and, for so many hardworking fishermen, poverty. Through the 1800s and early 1900s, Newfoundland was to experience the growing pains that would lead it to stand free as an island nation. Newfoundland's population in the early 19th century was comprised mainly of people from England and Ireland. Smaller groups came from the French-speaking Channel Islands. The Mi'kmaq, who had hunted here for generations, came from Cape Breton. Many Acadians also came from Cape Breton and the Magdalen Islands. Even Highland and Lowland Scots found their place. To make their livings, Newfoundlanders relied primarily on fishing and sealing. Cod was the undisputed backbone of the island's economy. Every day, fishermen headed out in small boats to bring in their catch. This inshore fishery, as it was called, was the way of life for most Newfoundlanders. Each spring, small fish called capelin spawned near shore and were followed by masses of hungry cod. The fish was unloaded and cleaned on makeshift wharves called stages. The cod had to be processed quickly and accurately. A good crew could handle up to 1,400 pounds of fish per hour. Life in the community of Grand Bank revolved around a different kind of fishery. The men headed off in banking schooners for up to 6 months. In this offshore fishery, men fished the Grand Banks, then headed up to Labrador, returning home only to deliver their catch. The schooners would lie out on the open ocean while the men cast off in small boats to harvest the cod. It was dangerous work. Every year, schooners and dories foundered, and many fishermen never came home. With the Grand Bank men away between April and November, it was the community's women who were primarily responsible for drying the cod on the wide cobble beaches. Called beach women, their uniforms consisted of aprons, pantaloons, and sunbonnets often made from white flour sacks. Bonnets protected their eyes from night blindness caused by glare reflecting off the cobblestones. Because beach work lasted into the night, many women fit in their household duties by rising at 3 a.m. Beach women worked in teams. The local merchant hired a boss woman who handpicked 12 others to join her. Each team prided itself on the quality of its cod. The process of drying cod took about 15 days of hard work. Every evening, the cod had to be piled and covered in case of rain. Merchants would send a culler to the beach to grade their product. The women were paid in credit notes, which they traded in for food and merchandise. However, the pay was not enough for many widows and women with large families, who often used up their notes early in the season, leaving nothing but hunger for the long winter ahead. Sis Walsh holding the traditional bonnet. She became a beach woman at age 14, and by 19 had lost her husband to the sea. Sis is among the last of the surviving Grand Bank beach women. To take advantage of cod stocks, fishing families dispersed along the coast and formed small, isolated outport communities which could only be reached by water. By the early 1800s, there were already over 1,000 outports. Small clusters of families had their own stories, songs, folklore, and some even their own dialect. Newfoundlanders all knew the swell of the ocean. Though the arrival of roads, electricity, and telecommunications broke the isolation of many outports, in Newfoundland there still remains a sense of suspended time. But today, hundreds of outports are abandoned, their inhabitants resettled to larger communities. These deserted villages are the ghosts of Newfoundland. On the south coast, a few isolated outports like McCallum remain. Without a road link, residents rely on the coastal boat to bring supplies, visitors, and the mail. Here, the pace and character of the traditional outport still lives. For almost every outport family, fish provided the only income. The work was exhausting and called for the labor of entire families. Poverty and debt were all too common. In Newfoundland, cod was currency, and the merchant was the banker. Merchants often held isolated communities in the grip of monopoly. They gave fishermen supplies such as salt on credit, and in return they received payment in cod. Many fishermen had debts that were carried over year after year. Fishermen felt powerless in this system, suspecting that the merchants fixed low cod prices. Attitudes were summed up in the saying, "A fisherman is one rogue, a merchant is many." With little to no cash to see them through the long winters, Newfoundlanders called winter's end, when root cellars were bare, the hungry month of March. This is why the seal hunt was so vital. A man could earn hard cash for 6 weeks' work in the spring. Thousands jumped at the chance. At sealing's peak in the 1850s, 14,000 men sailed into the hunt. Sealing was a locally developed industry driven by Britain's need for sea mammal oil for use in lighting and manufacturing. Fishermen descended on St. John's and other harbors to sign on as crewmen aboard sealing vessels. Each spring, crowds gave a rousing send-off from the wharves at St. John's. For the young fishermen of Newfoundland, the dangerous seal hunt was considered a rite of passage. The need for cash pressed Newfoundlanders to accept unimagined danger. Many sealing vessels were crushed in the ice. Others foundered in storms. Still others were accidentally blown up by the explosives used to break passage through the ice fields. Of all the harrowing years, 1914 is remembered as the most tragic. The SS Newfoundland is out on the ice fields, 40 miles from land. Frustration is at a peak. There are few pelts to show for the short season, and the crew's share of the earnings will be poor. Their captain, 29-year-old Westbury Kane, can do little. His old wooden vessel is again trapped in the ice. At 7 a.m., he sends his sealers over the side. They are to cross the ice to another vessel, the Stefano, commanded by his father, Abram Kane. The orders are clear. His father will feed them and take them to the seals, and that night they'll sleep on his father's ship. Rough ice makes the trip difficult. A few sailors, suspecting that a storm is on the way, head back to the Newfoundland. The rest take a full 3 hours to cross the 8 miles to the Stefano. An optical illusion has made the ship look closer than it really is. The men are taken aboard for a mug-up, some hot tea and hardtack bread. George Tuff is in charge of the sealers from the Newfoundland. He joins Captain Abram Kane for a meal. Kane is a formidable figure. He insists that after Tuff's men pan seals, they return to their own ship, the Newfoundland. Tuff explains that this contradicts his captain's orders, but Abram Kane is not a man to be argued with. Having barely rested, the 124 men are tired and grumbling when Kane sends them back over the side. When Tuff breaks the news that the Stefano is leaving and not returning for them, the men become enraged. Keeping a wary eye on the sky, they pan seals, and then, exhausted, they begin the long trek back to the Newfoundland. Then they are struck by one of the most furious storms on record. The snow is blinding. Though unsure of the Newfoundland's position, the sealers push on. They gather at dusk, knowing they must keep moving if they are to survive the night. It begins to rain. Temperatures plummet. Shrieking winds lash them with ice pellets. Captain Wes Kane finishes a sumptuous meal and prepares for bed. Since the wireless was removed from his ship as a cost-cutting measure, he's unable to contact the Stefano to inquire after his men. That night, Abram and Wes Kane each sleep soundly, secure in their belief that the sealers are safely aboard the other captain's ship. Yet in the raging fury of that night's storm, the abandoned men of the Newfoundland are dying. For the sealers, a pitiless dawn reveals curled-up bodies strewn across the ice. Reluctantly, survivors take clothing from the dead. James Donovan refuses. His son is furious, as his father had no cap, and without it, he will die from exposure. All that miserable day, the sealers search in vain for their ship. Men are dying on their feet. Like walking corpses themselves, each sealer in the line just steps over the dead. When James Donovan's son dies, James stoops down, takes his boy's cap, and continues on. Eyelids freeze shut. One man slashes his hand and drinks his own blood. Men are hallucinating. Some simply walk into the sea. Cecil Moland was only 21 years old.
The men start to die there. They start dying, and they were dying all day Wednesday, and all Wednesday night. You see them dropping here and dropping there. They die on their feet. They talk about their wives and their families and their children, mothers and fathers. They talked about practically everything. So I worked a little bit harder. I stamped and I slapped my hands, and I did everything to try to survive so if nobody else would get my girl. I wore out my boots almost to the inner soles to get back home to my girl, the one I loved.
For a second torturous night, the storm lashes the men of the Newfoundland. Frozen bodies dot the ice like sculptures. One father and son die together in an embrace. The following day, through his spyglass, Westbury Kane sees a few of his men staggering towards his ship. They're barely alive after 2 days and nights on the ice. By this time, other vessels have spotted wandering sealers. The rescue begins. Some sealers die in the arms of their rescuers. Others are so confused they run from them. The dead are crudely piled on the ship Bonaventure. After the terrible news is wired to St. John's, a crowd of 10,000 gathers at the harbor. There's hardly a sound. The Bonaventure arrives with its flag at half-mast, the frozen bodies of the dead covered by tarpaulins. The Florizel delivers some of the survivors. Like many others, Thomas Dawson will carry the scars of the disaster for the rest of his life. His frostbitten hands must be amputated. The dead are thawed and straightened for identification. All Newfoundland mourns. Company cost-cutting, the captain's stubbornness, and one of the worst storms of 1914 have cost 78 crewmen from the Newfoundland their lives. An inquiry absolves both Westbury and Abram Kane of responsibility in the deaths. People feel that Abram is morally responsible, and there is a mass demonstration. Yet Kane walks stoically through the crowd, and no one lays a hand on him. His career continues for another 20 years. That same storm caused another sealing vessel, the SS Southern Cross, to vanish from record with all 173 hands. The 1914 sealing disasters were the worst in Newfoundland's history. Newfoundland and Labrador's turbulent waters and craggy shores have claimed over 15,000 shipwrecks. Along this southeast coast near Cape Race, the landfall for European ships for centuries, over 2,000 people have perished at sea. The Atlantic can be vindictive and cruel. Every graveyard has its maritime tragedy. Every family a story, a brush with death, or worse, an empty chair at the table. As old-timers call it, marriage to the sea. Terrible as they were, the disasters of 1914 were a foreshadowing of even greater horrors to come.
The Grand Old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill and he marched them down again. And when they were up, they were up. And when they were down, they were down. And when they were only halfway up, they were neither up nor down.
When Britain entered the First World War in 1914, Newfoundland, a British colony, was drawn into the conflict. Still fiercely loyal to Mother England, Newfoundlanders were quick to enlist. During the war, 6,000 recruits trained for the Newfoundland Regiment. They joined some of the most terrible fighting, such as at Gallipoli and the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel. For their courage, they were the only regiment honored by King George V with the title Royal. The Great War laid waste to millions of lives. Because Newfoundland was so small, it could ill afford its brutally high casualty rate. 1/4 of Newfoundland's young men would never see their island again. The promise of much of an entire generation lost forever. Politically, Newfoundland by 1919 had reached a turning point. The war effort had earned the colony the right to be treated by England as a dominion, just like Canada and Australia. Yet this new status came at a high price. Newfoundland was strapped with millions of dollars of wartime debt, and there was a new population of dependents. The cost of the Great War had been crippling. War debt was heaped on top of old railway debt. Completed in 1897 was a costly rail line that cut through the island's interior. With the hope of accessing untapped resources and releasing Newfoundland from its reliance on the fishery, the government had caught the railway building fever that swept across North America. The railway opened up the forests to logging. This provided new opportunities for employment in the fall and winter months, as well as much-needed cash. The whir of the paper mill in Grand Falls was the sound of progress. And more of Newfoundland's ancient rock was made accessible. Ready for the taking was gold, pyrite, silver, fluorspar, lead, zinc, and iron. Before the railway, mining activity had been confined to the coasts. Newfoundland's first copper mine opened at Tilt Cove back in 1864. For a brief time, Tilt Cove also supplied 5% of the world's nickel. Its town once had 2,000 residents. Some mines, like this old copper mine outside Twillingate, were doomed to failure. Costly American equipment did little to improve the ore's poor yield, and the mine was abandoned in the early 1900s. One coastal mine near St. John's was an unqualified success. At one time, Bell Island's Wabana mine supplied half of neighboring Canada's iron needs. An island formed from compressed sediment, rich in minerals. Iron is the heart of this stone, and it's in the blood of every generation.
The boss will show you to your room, with a lighted lamp will show a gloom, and perhaps those walls will be your tomb. Wabana, you're a corker. Ye men that works down in the cave, your courage must be more than brave.
Though the mine has now been abandoned for decades, the ghosts of the Wabana mine still haunt even the quietest corners of Bell Island. In 1890, mining began on the surface. The men shoveled the ore into carts by hand. There was work for everyone, but it was brutal labor with little reward. A visiting journalist recorded a note scribbled on an ore cart. "I am killing myself for 10 cents an hour." Even boys as young as 9 sorted ore and took odd jobs. Many widows had to send their young sons to the mines in order for their families to survive. The surface ore was quickly depleted. By the turn of the century, the men headed underground. Shovel by shovel, they carted away enough ore to create the world's largest undersea iron mine, a maze extending kilometers under the ocean. Each shoveler loaded 17 tons of ore per 10-hour shift. They used to say, daylight comes on Sunday, their one day off. The hazards were many. Men were crushed by runaway ore carts, or killed in explosions when drills accidentally struck undetonated dynamite. The men shared their subterranean world with rats so bold that the miners had to hang their lunches out of reach. The horses used for hauling ore carts were stabled underground. After a hard life, they spent retirement grazing in near blindness. Over the years, the mine became less competitive as impurities in the Wabana ore rendered it unsuitable for modern steel production. Its markets dwindled. In 1966, the mine closed down forever, and the land was sold to the government for $1.
Sing not your fortunes in the dark dreary mine. It will warm as a hat and seep in your pores till the bones of your body are as red as the ore. Or dark as a dungeon, damp as the dew.
Today, the sea has reclaimed much of the dark maze where the miners once labored. Generations of islanders are still connected to the mine. Now 91 years old, Jim Kavanagh started mining at age 15. In all his working years, he only missed 3 shifts, one being on Christmas Day.
The boss will show you to your room, and the light and lamp will show it. Perhaps those walls will be your tomb, Havana, you're a core. Havana, you're a core.
While family incomes around the island varied, essentially Newfoundland society was clearly divided between workers, miners, loggers, and fishermen, and the elite who controlled their destiny. This latter group was educated, and it had money. Affluence is evident in the older homes. Homes belonging to the captains and merchants, such as in Grand Bank. The delicate trim work on this merchant's house in Harbour Breton was the work of local craftsmen. With the wealth amassed from seals and cod, some merchant families became homegrown dynasties, like the Munns of Harbour Grace and the Barbers of Newtown. Of the 74 captains in the area, 47 were named Barber. 5 Barber sons alone landed more than 1 million seals. The town of Bonavista had one of the wealthiest merchant families in Newfoundland. James Ryan, the eldest of 10 children, expanded the family's interest to include Labrador. The former Ryan premises is still a landmark in Bonavista. While the perception that merchants gained their wealth off the backs of families is widespread, less recognized are the risks merchants faced. Records show that during slumps in the fishery, rather than seeing a family go hungry, many merchants would extend credit. If a fisherman died or moved away, the merchant had to absorb the loss. It was not uncommon for merchants to go bankrupt. Newfoundland's bounty eventually landed in St. John's on the docks along Water Street. From here, dried cod and seal oil were shipped to foreign markets. The city was the unrivaled economic and political hub of the island. And it was here that the power elite were concentrated, the merchants, lawyers, and politicians. People in isolated outports were bitter about the merchants and politicians of St. John's, who they felt were greedy, arrogant, and self-serving. But one individual would emerge to challenge the fishocracy that was so deeply resented. William Coker's formal education ended at age 13, when he went to work to help support his family. Coker became a farmer and spent his winters reading and formulating opinions about the inequitable relationship between fishermen and merchants. In 1908 in Herring Neck, Coker gave a stirring speech to convince fishermen that collectively they could control their economic destiny and break the grip of the merchants. Pictured here is Coker with the first of 19 brave men who joined him. That night in 1908, the Fishermen's Protective Union was born. Traveling from outport to outport, Coker took on the task of uniting fishermen from isolated and fiercely individualistic communities. His message caught on. By 1914, the union was 20,000 strong. Coker established Port Union as his headquarters. From here he fought for better literacy, health care, and fair prices. The union created cooperative stores where fishermen could purchase their supplies and market their fish. This effectively eliminated the merchant as middleman. Homes were built for union staff. Coker's residence was called the bungalow. The newspaper, The Fisherman's Advocate, spread the Union gospel around the island. Coker gained so much sway that he was eventually made Minister of Marine and Fisheries. He became disillusioned when in 1921 his fishery reform legislation was repealed. However, rubbing shoulders with politicians tainted Coker's image. Many of his members turned their backs on him, feeling he had sold out. His retirement on a Jamaican estate only fueled this impression. Before retiring, Coker predicted that governmental overspending and the burden of debt from the war and the railway would finally lead Newfoundland to economic collapse. When the Great Depression descended, not even Coker could have imagined how dark those days would be.